From To Keto LLC, it's Keto Woman Podcast with Daisy Brackenhall.
Hello Keto lovelies, I'm Daisy Brackenhall, and I've spent most of my life struggling with my weight and confidence, and have always had a difficult relationship with food. Even when I finally got to my target weight after weight loss surgery and eating low carb, I couldn't maintain it and I was miserable. Keto has given me the freedom to fall in love with food again, without the constant gain, loss, guilt, virtue cycle of before. Health and happiness is where it's at now, running on fat. Welcome to the Keto Woman Podcast. Each week I'll be chatting to inspirational women, maybe even the odd man, to discover the secrets to their success so that I can share them with you. So what is keto? Keto is a way of eating that enables you to switch your body's main fuel source from sugar to fat. Who doesn't want to be a fat burner, right? But how do we achieve this? A great place to start is by keeping carbs to 20 grams or less per day. So things like leafy greens and above ground vegetables, plus some nuts and seeds and the incidental carbs you find in things like dairy. Moderate protein scale to your lean body mass, and then fat to satiety. Once you're in the swing of things, you can tweak it to suit you, make your own personalised keto. I'll be asking my guests each week what their keto looks like to show you just how flexible and fabulous this way of eating can be. I'm not a doctor, and most of my guests won't be either, so we can't give you medical advice. It's always best to work with your own doctor because they know you and your medical history, and so have access to the bigger picture. Thank you, Kristen Nicole, for supporting me and this podcast by making a pledge at my Patreon page. Do you want to hear your name here at the top of the show? Are you enjoying this podcast and would like to help me make more episodes? Then head to my Patreon page at patreon.com/KetoWoman, or hit the support button on the Keto Woman Podcast website. It means a great deal to me, and you will get to headline the show just like Kristen did today. This week's extraordinary woman is Amber O'Hearn. Amber O'Hearn, MSc, is a data scientist by profession with a background in math, computer science, linguistics and psychology. She has been studying and experimenting with ketogenic diets since 1997, and more recently writing and speaking about her findings. Her review on the evolutionary appropriateness and benefit of weaning babies onto a meat-based, high-fat, low-carb diet was included as testimony defending Tim Noakes in his recent trial. Amber has been eating a carnivorous diet for over 8 years. She writes a blog which she describes as eclectic explorations on the science of ketogenic diets at ketotic.org. And also has a personal blog page which is mostly about her experiences with carnivory at Empirica. That's empiri.ca. You can support Amber and the fantastic work she does by making a pledge at her Patreon page. Amber is speaking at Low Carb Breckenridge, and her lecture is called Ketosis Without Starvation, The Human Advantage. Details about all of these can be found in the show notes at ketowomanpodcast.com. I've been looking forward to talking to Amber and putting the questions to her that you wanted answers to. I could have quite easily gone on to part 3, to be honest, as she has such a wealth of information to share. As it is, we had to split the recording into 2 parts, so I hope you enjoy these 2 weeks of all things carnivore. Welcome, Amber, to the Keto Woman Podcast. It's great to have you here today. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. So why don't you tell the listeners a bit about yourself and how you got into zero-carb carnivore?
Sure. Well, I found low-carb diets when I was in my 20s in 1997. I was 24. And I had been very frustrated with a lot of weight gain. My history in vegetarianism didn't help even when I doubled down on that. And I finally decided to look into what this low-carb diet stuff was, and it happened to be the same year that the Eads had released Protein Power. And so I bought that book and read it with avid interest and tried out the principles, and it worked. So I've been doing a low-carb diet for a really long time, and it did help me with my weight issues. However, after many years and a couple of pregnancies, during which I was not very faithful to my low-carb diet for a variety of reasons, I had gained weight that I wasn't able to lose the way that I had lost initially, and I was very frustrated. And if we zoom forward to the end of 2008, I was extremely frustrated. I knew that if I didn't do my low-carb diet, my weight would then continue to rise, but if I did it to the best of my ability, I wasn't really losing what I had gained. And at that time, I was probably about 200 pounds, maybe a little bit less. I'm 5'6", and was getting to the point of desperation. And that's when I first heard about zero-carb diets, or ZC as people were talking about them at the time, where you would just eat meat and no plants. And there were a lot of people on a forum that I found called Zeroing In on Health who seemed to be in a position similar to where I was at that time, where they had been doing a low-carb diet and not getting the results that they wanted, and when they tried this, it worked for them. And I thought, well, that's something I could do. I mean, at least temporarily, I could do that in order to just get rid of the weight that's bothering me, go back to my regular low-carb diet, and all would be well. So that's how I got into it.
And I just want to go back a bit, because I see this come up quite a lot with women who get pregnant and ask the question about whether they can do low carb or keto for one while they're pregnant. And also you mentioned that you went off plan for a variety of reasons. And I was just wondering what those were. I've certainly heard people say, which sounds very logical to me, that they've almost been forced to eat some bland carbohydrates from the morning sickness and feeling sick, and it's the only thing that they could eat, and they got so desperate, I'm just going to eat crackers or pasta or whatever it was. I'd be interested to hear what you thought about that.
That was actually the most important part of it. Not only was I sick with morning sickness, but I have a strong family history of hyperemesis gravidarum, where my mother and sister and my mother's mother, for example, all of them had such severe sickness during pregnancy, and not just the beginning, but the entire pregnancy, that it was a medical issue. And fortunately for me, I never went through that, and I don't know if that had anything to do with the low-carb eating that had preceded it, or if I was just genetically lucky. But in any case, I did suffer quite severe nausea all the way through my pregnancies. And so there was a point where it was just a matter of, I'm going to eat whatever I'm going to eat to keep my food down. And then secondly, I wasn't really particularly worried about eating low carb while pregnant. I knew it was healthy for me, and I didn't have any strong reason to believe it wouldn't be healthy for the fetus. But my husband, at least for our first pregnancy, was not at all comfortable with that idea. He was, when we first met, he recounts a story of how he was so disappointed when he found out I was doing this crazy diet because he had thought I was really smart, and how could I believe this nonsense? So obviously by the time we were having our first child, he had recovered from his shock about that, but he still wasn't really on board about doing it during pregnancy. So I didn't have that kind of support, at least not during the first one. The third thing that I think goes into it is that in the first trimester of pregnancy, I think there's a really huge biological drive to get fat. And I think that, to me, those signals were eat whatever it is that you need to eat to get fat. And for me, that's carbohydrates. And I think that the cravings just went through the roof because of that. So I also think that's part of it. So if I had A, been super confident and supported in knowing that low carb would be healthy, and B, had been able to keep things down and somehow trust that the insulin or the cravings were going to go away, I might have stuck with it. But Actually, even in my last pregnancy where I was already doing a carnivorous diet, I had such intense carbohydrate cravings that I gave into them and said, well, it's going to be what it's going to be. So that was my best shot, and I still didn't stay carb-free.
That's very interesting. And you found, presumably, at some point that you just made that decision to go back, or it became almost like the reverse of the carbohydrate cravings you had while you were pregnant. Did you then have cravings to go back to carnivore at some point, when you'd given birth? Or, when did that change? When did you make the journey back to carnivore?
Well, in the case of the first 2 pregnancies, I was not yet a carnivore. And I simply was driven motivationally to go back to a low-carb diet because I'd gained so much during the pregnancy and I was ready to get rid of that. But by the time the 3rd pregnancy happened, it's actually quite interesting because I had been finding out about this zero-carb phenomenon at the end of 2008. If I'd found out maybe a week or 2 earlier, I might have made it my New Year's resolution. But as it was, I wasn't quite ready to make the jump, and I started carnivory about 3 weeks into January in 2009, and my whole plan was, I'm going to do this for 3 weeks, and then it's going to be my birthday, and I'm going to have birthday cake, and then we'll see where I am. And by the time those mere 3 weeks had passed, I was so overcome with the health effects and the way it affected me. The weight was dropping. My mood had improved drastically. And I just knew I had no intention of ever going back in the foreseeable future. However, about a week later, I found out I was pregnant, and that was my 3rd pregnancy. And even then, by that time, I'd done a lot of research into the safety of ketogenic diets during pregnancy, and my husband had no more reservations whatsoever, and this was going to be a zero-carb pregnancy. But like I said, I ended up caving in at some point. But I would say over the course of the pregnancy, I got lower and lower carb in the way I was eating, until by, say, the last trimester, I was having some zero-carb days. And then within less than a week of birth, I went straight back to carnivory because, wild horses couldn't drag me away at that point.
Interesting. So it was really a decision to get back into it, but you also felt able to, from a physical perspective, you'd lost those overwhelming cravings that you'd had during pregnancy.
That's right. Yes, and all the nausea, of course, completely evaporated.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I'm a real baby when it comes to feeling sick. I can't stand it. It's one of the worst things. To have that for months and months on end would just drive me absolutely round the bend.
I agree.
Really not pleasant. And one thing we talk about this term, zero carb, carnivore, and I know we've had this discussion before about, what to call it, what label to give this way of eating. And, it's most people, I suppose, or at least did. I think it's changing more, but it had this zero carb label. But that's actually from a logical perspective. I mean, it's not zero carb, is it? Perhaps you could just talk a little bit about, what your preferred term is for this way of eating.
Sure. The term zero carb was what people were calling it when I found it, and I'm really grateful to those people and those groups for leading me to where I am, and so there's some kind of honor in continuing to refer to it that way. Also, it's a lot shorter, zero carb, and ZC especially is easier to write and say. But it just seems to me to be such a point of confusion because a lot of people will say, especially if you're counting net carbs, for example, if they eat vegetables that are high in fiber, they'll call that a zero carb diet. I think Paul Jaminet had a whole series arguing against zero carb diets, and he wasn't even talking about what I or other people would mean by zero carb diets. He just meant with absolutely no digestible carbohydrates. So the definition, or what people mean by zero carb, is really zero plants. So to eat a zero carb diet, what they're really talking about is eating only meat. At the most extreme level, you're not even having any spices and you're not drinking anything except water. And because it's a meat-only way of eating, I prefer to call it carnivorous, because to me a carnivore is an animal that eats only meat. Of course, even in the biological world, the word carnivore is not very straightforward, it turns out. Animals who eat only 30% of their diet from meat are sometimes called carnivores. And of course, in just regular talking, if you ask someone if they're a carnivore, they usually assume that you just mean not vegetarian. So it's not a perfect turn either, but I think it's at least a little bit clearer.
Yes, it comes closer to the logic, doesn't it? In just, like you say, you're basically ruling out pretty well everything from the plant kingdom. You're really only eating either animals themselves or also includes something animals have produced.
Right.
So, and we'll go on to that with the questions we get into about, what is included and what isn't included in this way of eating. But perhaps you could talk a little bit, because it specifically really interests me, about the benefits you have, particularly for your mental health.
Yes, well, this was something that I hadn't expected at all. I had in the past noticed that the stricter I was with a low-carb diet, that the better my mood was. But it wasn't addressing my really deep mood problems. You see, the other thing that had deteriorated my health and that I had no idea was in any way dietarily connected was that I had had depression since I was diagnosed at 20 as having major depressive disorder. I was on antidepressant drugs from my 20s, and my depression started changing in my early 30s so that I was also starting to have symptoms that were later led to me being re-diagnosed as having a kind of bipolar disorder called bipolar type 2, where you don't have psychotic manias, but you do have hypomanias, which are sort of the mood state that in someone with manic depression would be the beginning of a manic episode. So there's pressured speech and a lot of excitement, feeling euphoric, which for someone who was used to having depression, actually, at first I thought, oh, I'm getting better. I feel better than I've ever felt in my life, but that's really not how it went. So I had this bipolar disorder, new diagnosis. I tried many different medications, and the medications were worse than the disease, honestly. They didn't really help with the mood issues, and each of the ones I tried had terrible side effects, and it seemed to me like the cycles were getting progressively closer together. I was experiencing more different kinds of moods that were uncomfortable, like anxiety, which I'd never really experienced before, extreme irritability. It was a nightmare. And what happened when I tried this zero-carb carnivorous diet in the end of January in 2009 was that within 2 weeks, my mood was incredibly stable, like it had never been before. And it was so astonishing that I wasn't even sure that it was really happening. It wasn't until I talked to my husband about it that we said, yeah, this is a real phenomenon. This is pretty interesting. And that's when I knew that this was something really special that I was going to have to continue with.
I mean, that's incredible how fast it had an impact, especially considering how many, many years you'd been having issues for. Just by changing the way you ate, within a couple of weeks, you'd seen this incredible difference. I mean, I can completely understand why you thought this is just some kind of freaky coincidence. It must have been actually really handy to have someone else's perspective, because if you'd have been on your own, you might possibly have thought you were just going a bit mad.
Yes, it was astonishing. And it wasn't really until I got back into it after the birth of my third child and had a longer term experience that I could start to feel like, yeah, this is really stable. This is really having a major impact.
That was something I was thinking about, actually, when you mentioned before about coming off. And perhaps the difference wasn't so markedly obvious because you hadn't been eating that way for so long before you became pregnant and stopped for a time. But did you notice, because it's definitely something that I notice, because I found real benefits from keto with my depression, and it's something that is like a switch that switches the depression back on if I go off plan. So is that something you noticed when you stopped for a period of time during your pregnancy? Did you notice those mood swings coming back and then going away again when you went back to carnivore? Or was that, with the whole hormonal soup thing going on with pregnancy, did that not work the same way that you might expect?
It's a little bit hard to tell if there's a conflation there, because pregnancy is such a hormonal roller coaster that I probably would be suffering from mood difficulties regardless of how clean my diet was. So yes, I was an emotional wreck while I was pregnant, but whether or not that had to do with going off of my carnivorous diet or how much to attribute to that, I'm not sure.
Right. So how long has it been now then? Where are we? 2018. So it must have been, what is that, about 9 years now you've been carnivore?
Yeah, 9 years on the outside if you count from when I first discovered it, but because I had that kind of blip where I wasn't actually carnivorous, you might say it's just over 8. It depends on how generous you're going to be, but something in that ballpark. It was 9 years ago that I knew that this was going to be a long-term project.
So, and it's really, obviously for the length of time you've been doing it, it's something that you've seen so many benefits from, you're never going back from.
Yes. That's not to say that my diet won't change over time, or I might not find out that something that I previously thought I couldn't eat, maybe I could. I must say, though, I'm not that eager to try to test things out because it's obviously a heavy cost. If I try to eat something and it doesn't go well, then I can be quite compromised. Although on the other hand, it seems to, like you said earlier, the improvement happened so fast that I feel quite confident that if I did eat something that were going to give me problems, within 2 weeks at the very latest, I should be right back on again.
Yes, that's something I found, to be honest. Obviously, it's better just to stay on plan the whole time. But, life happens, and for me, it's usually when I go back to the UK. And I can feel my mood going down, and it usually carries on going down when I get back. But I know now there's this well-worn path that I know how to get back out of it. And I know it's the same for me. It's a week or two before I know, if I just follow the steps that I know how to take and I just kind of switch myself onto autopilot, that I will start feeling better again before too long.
It's a powerful place to be.
Exactly. It's better not to put yourself in that position, but, it happens for some people. And to know you've got a way out is very reassuring. So I asked my Facebook group, and we also asked on the ketogenic forums, what questions people had about zero carb, carnivore, way of eating. And you very kindly agreed to have a good stab at answering all those questions.
Yes.
So without further ado, shall we jump into those?
Bring it on. I'll do my best.
We'll start with a question from Erin McFarland. Really, just talking about the differences with keto. So what are the biggest differences between zero carb carnivore and keto?
That's a great question. Carnivore and keto are alike in that there are many, many factions of people saying what is and isn't keto and how to do it right and how to do it wrong. With keto, I think the ultimate definition is, are you showing ketones or not in the blood? And then there's some arbitrary cutoff where if you're, say, at 0.5 millimoles, then yes, you're on a ketogenic diet. And if you're not there, then you're not. But nonetheless, there would still be discussion about whether you're doing a ketogenic diet that's a healthy ketogenic diet or a well-formulated ketogenic diet or not. And there's still a lot more to decide on rather than that to make a diet that serves your needs the best. With carnivory, basically it's about how much plant matter is going into your diet. At a certain point, if you're eating enough plants, I think that no one would want to fairly call you a carnivore. On the other hand, even some of the veterans like me who have been on a carnivorous diet for a long time aren't purely carnivores. We're not eating just meat and water. I drink coffee, for example, and if I go to a restaurant and there's an option to have a meat dish and it's got spices on it, I'll usually just eat that, even if it's not maybe the best for me or what I would cook at home. And so I think there's a little bit of leeway in what would be considered carnivorous or not. But for the most part, I would say that a carnivore means you're not eating plants on any daily basis, except perhaps spices or some teas or coffee. And you don't have things that are literally zero carb, but are plants. So, for example, plant oils would be out for most people, and things that are just fiber would be out. And then on the other side of the scale, you could eat something that's an animal-sourced food but has some carbohydrate in it, like liver or eggs or shellfish, and no one would bat an eye at that. Although something like milk, maybe, at least culturally, wouldn't be very acceptable.
Right, yes, interesting. So there's a lot of overlap. I see it in some ways as taking the ketogenic diet that sort of step further. It's that sort of added, it's these layers of restriction you have from a just standard diet, and you dial it down each time.
I'd agree with that, but I'd also say in some ways it's kind of a step back, because not back in the regression sense, but when you're on a carnivorous diet, the idea usually is to eat to hunger and to not try to eat to some particular macronutrient ratio, which means that oftentimes people on carnivorous diets are eating a higher amount of protein, although it's still definitely going to be a high-fat and moderate protein diet, and you're usually going to be in ketosis, but the emphasis is different, and most people who are on a carnivorous diet don't measure ketones, don't try to attain a specific level of ketosis, and just have a different focus on what their diet's trying to achieve.
Right, yes, that's very interesting. So is that something that you ever do? Do you ever measure your ketones out of, not necessarily to sort of be hitting some kind of level, but I mean, I certainly measure, I like to correlate things like my mood against what my ketone levels are. And I certainly find I need a minimum amount, but I also find if I go too high, if my blood ketones are too high, I start feeling a bit off, I get really twitchy and it's like I've been drinking too much coffee or something. And so I definitely have a band, and I like just monitoring, usually daily, my mood against the ketone levels, just more out of interest rather than having to hit a certain level. Do you ever look at those levels to see how you're feeling against the level?
I don't normally measure ketones, although I'll sort of go into phases where I'll measure them for a while. I got more interested in measuring in more recent years because a lot of people were really worried about whether or not a zero-carb carnivorous diet was in fact ketogenic. And I wanted to know what the answer to that question is. And of course, I'm only one person, but from my own readings and from what I've heard from other people, it generally is, but it's generally milder than you might get if you were targeting a kind of 80-20 macronutrient level. So the answer is I don't measure them in order to look at that as feedback and then modify my diet to try to hit a specific level, but like you, I am really curious about what is going on metabolically.
Yes, it's interesting because, I mean, my specific interest is really how it impacts my mood. And I know that's something that is really important to you with the way you eat. And so I was just interested to know, I would assume that the likelihood is that you would be in ketosis eating the way you do. But I'm very interested to know whether producing those ketones is something that impacts your mood, or is it specifically more just what you're eating rather than your ketone level? I'm not making a huge amount of sense. I kind of know what I'm getting at in my own mind, but I'm wondering if those levels specifically are impacting mood, whether it's the food, and so you could be eating the way you do and not be in ketosis. So for you, it's the diet and not necessarily a certain level of ketones that's impacting your mood.
That's right. It's fascinating, actually, because I wouldn't previously have expected it, but it seems to me that the quality of the diet has a much stronger effect on my mood than the level of ketosis. That is, I can go out of ketosis or get to very low ketosis levels and still feel like my mood is absolutely stable. My energy levels might be a little bit less, but my mood is good. Whereas, like you, I've experienced, if my ketosis level is very high, that might not be very good. But I don't think that I ever noticed that just staying in a strict level of ketosis had anywhere near the impact on my mood that excluding plants does. And I don't know why.
Right. Yes. Fascinating. So you would potentially then be impacted. So if you were to have, I don't know, you probably have an example of something maybe that you could eat that would be low enough that it's not going to affect your level of ketosis, but it would affect your mood. I don't know, maybe if you were to use garlic or parsley or something. I mean, I don't know, maybe you have an example where it's something quite small that is not going to impact your level of ketosis, but you definitely see an impact on your mood.
Yes. I haven't done an extensive or systematic kind of study of that, obviously, because, I don't want to end up feeling depressed.
Feel bad. Yeah.
But I've had some problems with certain supplements I've tried in the past. For example, I tried alpha-lipoic acid one time just out of curiosity because of some of the apparent neurological benefits that I thought it might give me, and that caused huge, almost immediate mood repercussions. I have tried an extract. I can't remember exactly what it's called. DIM, maybe. It's a broccoli extract, and that took about maybe 4 or 5 days before I was lying on my bed, looking at the ceiling, wishing I was dead, and then I went, oh, I've been here. What's going on? And cut out the supplement, and I was suddenly good again. Another thing I tried one time was, you may know that I've done some study into some possible mechanisms. One of them is the fact that plants are full of toxins as a kind of biochemical defense against predators. Well, I thought maybe if I ate fiber, just pure fiber, so it isn't a source of phytochemicals, I wonder if that would also hurt me. And I took one day, this was recently, it was just last year, and I'm not even sure I've really talked to anyone publicly about it before, but I took 1 spoon of psyllium husk and stirred it into my coffee, And by that afternoon, I had to leave work because my head was it was a jumble of crazy thoughts. At first, I just went out to the car. I said, I'm just going to take a break. And I sat in the car and began sobbing. So wow. I have no idea what's going on, but it seems like fiber is not my friend.
Goodness me. And yeah, I mean, such a small amount. And that's certainly not something that's going to impact your level of ketosis, but it obviously had a huge impact on your mood.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And right, I'm going off on my my own interest here, so I have to rein myself back into the questions I've got written in front of me.
Before you go on, if I could add one thing, and maybe it'll actually come up in the questions, but there are other things that improved for me besides my mood and my weight. One of the health problems that I had that I also didn't connect with diet was that I had developed rosacea. There are different kinds of rosacea. The kind I had was just that my face would flush and turn very red, and it wouldn't subside, basically, ever. The flushing would subside, but then the redness would stay for days on end. And when I started this carnivorous diet, I essentially have no flushing episodes ever again, except for certain triggers. Decaf coffee is one, who knows why. But coconut oil is one. Coconut oil will give me a rosacea flushing episode. And so there are multiple things that are not necessarily going to affect my ketosis level. In fact, coconut oil should increase my ketosis level, but that are having an effect on my health that's detrimental.
Yes, fascinating. And I know that's a topic that I've seen come up really regularly recently, actually, in the Facebook group about people struggling with that. So I think they're going to find that fascinating. And there's probably going to be a whole lot more people trying giving this way of eating a go. I've seen a marked increase in the last couple of months in particular. I don't know whether, perhaps it's the whole New Year's resolution has something to do with it, but I've seen a lot of people giving it a go recently.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sean Baker had his World Carnivore Month in January. Actually, I think his influence has been extraordinarily profound. I don't know exactly how long he's been doing a carnivorous diet, but it may be about a year. And the increase in interest just from his followers seems to be extraordinary.
Well, yeah, like I say, I've certainly seen a big increase in people giving it a go, which we can see by all these questions we've had that I'm not asking you. I've managed one so far from the
okay,
list, so
go.
I better get back to it. So we've got a group of questions here that's really just about what foods you do and don't eat. And the first one is from Carolina Cartier. She would like to know the various types of carnivory. Some include spices, eggs, seafood, mayo, etc., while some are just steak, butter, and salt. We've already touched on that a little bit, but perhaps you could go into a bit more detail.
And I don't think that anyone would call someone who eats a lot of seafood or eggs not carnivorous. A lot of people eat eggs and seafood, but I have noticed that there is a trend toward preference of ruminant animals, actually. Beef and sometimes lamb just seems to satisfy people more in the long run. And I don't know if that's in part because it's fattier. If you were going to do this based on a seafood diet, you would probably have to add a lot of butter or tallow in order to get enough calories. Or if there's something about red meat, or if it's just a reflection of our cultural preferences, I don't know. But there's certainly many ways to do it that I think would be perfectly valid and legitimate.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily a list of what you can eat. Well, I mean, it is, but it's more a case of a list of what you don't eat. I mean, really just not having anything from the plant kingdom. So, but anything that's, it doesn't have to specifically be meat. It can be seafood as well.
Mm-hmm. And some of those sort of forbidden foods get more of a pass than others. So she mentioned spices and mayo. And even though mayo's plant-based, you're much more likely to see a carnivorous person having a bit of that and a bit of spices than having, say, some lettuce. It's just considered a little bit more benign, even if there isn't really rhyme or reason to it from the outside.
Mm-hmm. And she has, again, it's the continuation of the same question, really, but can you use fruit fats? Would that hinder anything? And the examples she gives are avocado, coconut, and olive oils.
I've already mentioned coconut oil a bit. My own response to it with the rosacea. I've heard other people have responses that include headaches or pain that had gone away previously. Some people speculate it's the salicylates in it. I don't really know what's causing that. My own advice would be, if you're going to go to all the trouble of trying this, try it without first and then introduce them and see. And then if you end up finding a diet that works great for you and it's carnivorous, but you use olive oil, I don't think anyone's going to, think less of you for it.
Exactly. Yes, that's a good point, actually. And I have tried eating this way. I don't think I gave it long enough. I only did it for maybe a couple of weeks, might even have been less, and I caved and went back to my vegetables. But I am really tempted to give it another go, listening to you talking about it. But the thing that I was going to say was that it is actually a very useful way to do an elimination diet. If you suspect certain foods are impacting you negatively, it's a really good way to sort of clear the decks, isn't it? Just to eat really simply. And for me, I don't like to admit that dairy is an issue, but I think it probably is. So
you wouldn't be alone.
So being really quite strict carnivore and just, sticking to meat probably basically for what would you say, 30 days would be the period of time that you really need to give it a go for? Well,
there's some disagreement about that. I think 30 days is a really good amount of time because most people, I think, will get a really good idea of how it's going to work for them in that period of time. And it seems like it's short enough that you can commit to it without thinking that it's just too much. I know that other people in the community insist that until you've done it for about 6 months, you really don't know how it's going to go or what things might resolve for you. And I think maybe if you have some particularly troubling health issues that you suspect will resolve with more time and you're willing to try it and you're not experiencing some kind of side effect that's making it unbearable, then by all means do that. I would never want to discourage someone from trying it longer, but I just think it's a little bit much to ask to go beyond about 30 days if you're not seeing benefits by that time.
Like you say, it does feel a lot more doable. It's not an overwhelming and unreasonable amount of time to set yourself, I'm just going to do this for 30 days and that's it, and we'll see how it goes. And really, you should be likely to see some kind of benefit in that time. It's long enough to see some kind of benefit, even if you might not yet have the full benefit from it.
Yes, that's what I would think.
Right. Okay, so next question. We're carrying on with the foods that you eat or don't eat. And this one is from Carol McKay McMillan. When eating carnivore, do you use whole milk, yogurt, kefir, and other animal products? Do you use spices on all that lovely meat, salt, and pepper? So we have already touched on this, but I'm certainly quite interested in how much dairy you include in your diet.
So dairy seems to be somewhat an individual question because some people seem to be a lot less tolerant of it than others in different ways. For me, I have eaten some small amount of dairy most of the time that I've been carnivorous, and it doesn't compromise the mood benefits that I'm getting. I think it does impact my weight to a certain degree, and I think that I have a kind of addictive response to it, especially fermented or aged dairy. I seem to want more of that, even if I'm not hungry by any other measure.
I know that feeling.
And then there is the issue that we touched on earlier about just the sheer carbohydrate count. If you do want the benefits of a low-carb diet or at least mildly ketogenic diet, then eating a lot of whole milk is just going to be too much carbs for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And the spices, because I think certainly that's something that I feel like I would really miss. Maybe I wouldn't given enough time, but I do really like flavouring my food with all sorts of spices. How much of those do you use, or do you keep it really simple?
Well, I'll tell you my experience, and then I'll tell you some philosophical thoughts that I've had about it. When I tried this, with the exception of coffee, I completely eliminated all spices and extra added salt. And for the first couple of days, it was really bland and boring, even though it was a ribeye. And then within a few days, really, the flavor of the meat started to come out, and I was really struck by how delicious it was. And I found that for the first time in my life, I was wanting it not well done. I know it's like a cone of shame, but I used to really like well done meat because I didn't eat a lot of meat. And when I ate it, it was not really the main thing that I was eating for the taste of. But the taste really comes out better when it's cooked less, I find. And from that experience, another thing that I've found by just listening to anecdotes of others and by talking to people who have been kind enough to share their experiences with me, if you remove the spices and all sweeteners, which some people have a really hard time giving up even when they do their carnivorous trial, they'll keep the sweetener in their coffee or something like this. When you eliminate all of those things, you go through this kind of palate resensitization that not only results in the experience I just explained of getting to taste your food better, but there's a almost miraculous kind of loss of obsession with food that I've never really seen in any other experience described, where suddenly, instead of the way that I was when I was on a keto diet or a low-carb diet all those years, I would be planning all these recipes. I would be planning what I was going to have for dinner. I'd be planning what I was going to have for lunch. Food was just something that was always on my mind. It was always part of my day. And very soon after I dropped all those things, food was just, when I got hungry, suddenly I would find something and cook it. And it's so simple that, so the simplicity of it also meant that I had to plan less. But I just feel like it gave up real estate in my brain that I didn't know I was using all the time. And I've heard that from a lot of other people too. And so I think that spices and sweeteners perpetuate a kind of relationship with food that may be chemical, that may be not optimal. And this happened without any kind of compromise of the enjoyment of food. So when I sit down and I've got that ribeye, if I'm so lucky, or even just a burger or whatever it is, it's delicious. But when it's done, it's done. And that freedom has been unexpected and really quite welcome. The one other thing I'll say about spices is that a couple of years ago, I took a job as a programmer where we had a buffet catered lunch 3 days a week. And so I thought, well, it's not going to be the food I would cook at home, but there's meat there. I can just eat the spiced meat or pull the cold cuts off sandwiches if it's sandwiches that day, and it's really not that big a deal. And it wasn't that big a deal in terms of mood. I didn't notice that I started becoming depressed, but I gained 20 pounds in 4 months. And wow. I can't say, there are a lot of factors. I'd started a new job. Maybe I was differently active, or my patterns of eating were somehow different. But I decided to stop eating the catered lunches, and my weight went back down after another 4 months. So I think that there may be a kind of small impact on eating, maybe even on appetite, that could be an effect of spices as well.
I was going to say, I can see it certainly having an effect on appetite, that spices encourage you to eat more, but certainly a sweet taste often does. If you have something sweet, it really stimulates the palate and makes you want to eat more. And the more you talk about this, it does seem logical to me. When you were saying about, obviously there's that transition period where you have to get used to not having the spices and things, but the flavor of that base food that you're eating comes out. Well, it's a similar thing with when you start keto and your sensitivity to sweetness increases. So, you suddenly find all these foods that taste really sweet, like, red peppers and carrots.
Yes.
Exactly. They have the natural, that before you wouldn't have thought were particularly sweet at all. So it really makes sense that the more you're taking out, the more you appreciate the real flavor of that food you're eating. And of course, historically, things like spices were actually used to disguise the flavor of meat as it was potentially going bad.
Yes. And I wouldn't want to eat vegetarian food without spices. I mean, really, it doesn't have as much to carry on its own. If we were talking about rice or potatoes or lentils or something, without spices would be not very palatable at all. I know it sounds kind of hard-assed to say, no, not even spices. And I would say, if it's really important to you, or if you don't think you could do it without them, then do it. But try it without, and I think that might be an interesting experience too.
Exactly. I think that's a very good point. That just try it without for 30 days and then, bring it back in if you want to. But you don't know until you try, do you? So talking of the few exceptions, I suppose, to that mythical rule book, is a question from Erin McFarland. I presume she's just talking about the zero-carb carnivore community here, also recommend eliminating coffee, as they say it weakens the adrenals. What are your thoughts on this? Now, I know you do drink coffee, so I expect you do have some thoughts on it.
I do drink coffee. Coffee is a drug, and so even though it's a plant origin and there's traces of plant in it, I would say for most people, if you're going to try this and you're used to drinking a lot of coffee, you don't necessarily want to add the added complication of quitting coffee, which is not a trivial thing to do for a lot of people. On the other hand, it is a drug, and the scientific literature on it is mixed about whether it's a net benefit, which some studies show, whether it's a net detriment, which other studies show, or whether it's just neutral. And so I drink it. I have tried going without it sometimes and not noticed particular benefits for me. And so it's something I've decided to keep, but it's not something, I'd recommend people start drinking coffee necessarily. So I don't have strong opinions about that. I could definitely understand supporting either point of view there.
So it really comes down to an individual choice, doesn't it? And I suppose I have started drinking more coffee again, but I have been more drinking tea, green tea. Is tea something that would come under the same category as coffee, or?
I would think so. Green tea is another rosacea trigger for me, so I don't get to have it. But if it weren't for that, I would consider it a fair alternative. Right.
So again, it comes down to personal choice and how it impacts you. And obviously, if you find it impacts you negatively, which is the benefit of eliminating stuff for a while.
Yes.
And then testing. Okay, so this is a question from Andrew Lacarnew. Do you still make things like crustless quiches, Scotch eggs without nut flours, or is it pieces of meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner?
Pretty much the latter. I do eat eggs, and I will make an omelet sometimes, and I cook for my children, and I'm much more likely to make recipe-type things for them. But for me, I just find the simpler, the better.
Yes, like you were saying before, it does just make it easier, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. And again, the craving for variety has subsided to the degree where if I were just eating steak every day, I'd probably be fine with that.
I think that's the trick, isn't it? I think when you are still in a position of having cravings, the thought of giving those up is what's frightening. And that's certainly the thing that people worry about looking to start keto. Well, how can I possibly give up bread or pasta or whatever it is? But then they find when they do start eating that way that actually the cravings go away, so they no longer want it, so it's not scary anymore. So I suppose you have people like me sitting here thinking, well, the thought of giving up those spices and those flavorings and the vegetables that I do have is a daunting prospect that I can't imagine because I still have those cravings. But what you're saying is potentially, actually, when you eliminate them for a while, those cravings go away and you no longer want them. So it's not that seemingly really super restrictive diet because the cravings have gone.
That's right. If it required willpower, I might have lasted a couple months, maybe on the outside, but no way I would have been able to keep it up this time. And I should say, there's definitely variety still available. If you want salmon one day and chicken wings the next and pork ribs the day after that, there's a lot more besides steak that you could have that's still well under the umbrella.
It's funny how most people do seem to come down, like you said before, particularly beef, but beef and lamb seem to be the favourites that people, if they could just eat those every day, would. Every
once in a while you'll see a poll go by. If you had to eat just one food for the rest of your life, what would it be? And it's about 99% beef.
And do you eat 3 meals a day, or what is your general pattern of eating?
I rarely eat more than twice a day. I usually don't eat my first meal until somewhere between 11 or 1, and then a second one maybe 4 or 5 hours after that. Occasionally, I'll eat just 1 meal a day, especially if I'm busy. If I'm out and about, it doesn't really seem worth the bother to stop and eat. I'm more of I'm in the kitchen now, and I become interested. Or if I'm cooking for my family, then I become interested. But I'll eat 3 meals a day on occasion. But I don't normally try to eat a particular way on purpose, although I have played around with that a bit. But what it settles out typically for me is lunch and dinner.
Mm-hmm. And just basically eating when hungry and when it's convenient as well, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
This one's from Joey Vorter. Do you still incur incidental carbs while zero carb? If so, what does that look like? I know, macro question, but I'm wondering about your protein to fat macros. So I suppose we have touched on this a bit, but you did mention before the importance of having fatty protein.
Yes, I think if you don't get enough fat, you will start to either not feel well in a kind of rabbit starvation way, or you will just be hungry, and then you'll either not eat enough because you know that you don't want more protein, or you'll try to make up for it with too much protein and then not be feeling well or suffering consequences of that. I think that we can eat quite a bit of protein, certainly a lot more than just the bare minimum that we would need for adequacy, and still be pretty safe. But once you're getting to, I think the standard number that people quote is about 3 grams per kilogram of body weight. Once you're getting above that, then there's some reason to believe that wouldn't be very healthy. I try to emphasize fatty meats, both because they're more delicious and because I know that as soon as I've had enough protein, what I really need is just more calories. And I think that if you were, if you're brought up in the 80s, or you just otherwise didn't have a lot of exposure to eating a lot of fat, or have had it instilled in you that fat is going to make you fat or cause other health problems, it might be difficult to get used to this idea of actually eating enough fat. If you're coming from keto, that's probably not a problem. But one thing that I've seen both on keto and on zero carb is if you're not willing to eat enough fat, you're simply not going to eat enough, then you're going to get tired, possibly have hormonal or mood issues, and then you're going to say the diet doesn't work. And so I think it's really important to make sure that you are eating enough and getting enough fat.
And I've heard, everyone talks about ribeyes, but I've heard them mentioned specifically that they're really good because they have that ideal ratio, I think, of 2-to-1 fat to proteins. They're really, really nice and fatty.
It really depends on the trimming, but yeah, if you can get them with all the fat on them that's separate, plus get them really marbled, they can be just divine. We talked about measuring a bit already, and I don't tend to weigh and measure my food. And in any case, with something like a ribeye, you're left a little bit to the mercy of a chart that's not going to be exactly the fat to protein ratio that the piece of meat you have is. But when I have measured it and tried my very best to get an idea of what I was eating, it would come out always somewhere between 65 and 80% fat. And it would vary within there. And so I'm pretty happy to see that because it validates or verifies for me the idea that if you're just eating to satiety, you're going to eat a high-fat diet.
Exactly. And that's where, I know some people really do love tracking, but it's so imperfect because the figures that you're using, whether they're from the packet of the food you've eaten or whether they're something you've got from our good old friend Google, it's just going to be some kind of average. It's not going to be specific to that piece of food that you're eating, is it?
Mm-hmm. And
it's always going to be a bit of a guesstimate.
Heaven forbid you try to eat an omelet and figure out how many pieces of the bacon exactly you got in your share,
Exactly. And when I'm picking bacon off the shelves, every packet says the same amount of protein and fat, but I'm picking the bacon off that has, loads of fat compared to the ones that are really lean. So the macros listed are just not going to be accurate, are they?
Exactly. And even with ground beef where they'll, you would expect some kind of standardization. If it says 85%, it's going to be 85%. In practice, it's my understanding that can vary by 5 or 10% in either direction too. So yeah, it's an art, not a science.
Exactly. So people who are trying to hit these, daily, quite specific macro goals, they're never going to be accurate, even at the best of times. You've kind of answered this next question, really, from Carolina Cartier. Do you calculate protein and fat macros or just eat? But she does mention specifically for weight loss versus maintenance. She says that she can eat quite a lot of meat before reaching satiety. And I wonder if that's harping back to how much fat is in your meat. And I guess that you probably naturally, by the sounds of it, you don't track, but have you seen that you vary how much you eat or the craving for different kinds of meat have changed when you are actively trying to lose weight between that and when you're maintaining weight?
There's a lot of angles to that. One is that there have been times, my weight since, I guess, initially I lost weight down to about 135 pounds from over 195. And then since then, which I don't know, maybe 7 years ago, I have gone up and down from about 128 or a little bit below that, up as far as 145, up and down without much rhyme or reason that I could tell, and without much response actually to my conscious intervention when I have tried to say, oh, this is maybe too much. That 145 was during that time that I talked about earlier where I was at work and eating from that buffet. That's when I got that high. But even since then, I've never been able to find a really good correlation for me about any aspect of my lifestyle and where my weight is. And I kind of have come to think that maybe there are just other things, other factors going on in my life and my body that are causing my body to say, this is the weight we're going to be now, and this is the weight we're going to be now, and you just stay out of it. As long as I'm not, gaining weight out of control, I'm not too worried about it, even though I thought I looked, really great when it was 128 and I fit my cutest clothes. But in terms of whether more protein or more fat is going to be better for weight loss, that's a hugely contentious issue in the community right now. There are some people who insist that if you want to lose weight, you've got to up the protein and cut the fat. And there are other people that insist that the only thing that works for them for weight loss is to lower the protein and up the fat. And who am I to say which of those is right? I think if you really do want to actively work on weight loss while eating a zero-carb diet, I think, there are reasons, and maybe we'll get into it with further questions, why it's sometimes good to get out of the way and let your body do its own thing based on actual hunger signals. But if you are going to try to intervene, I don't even know which of those is a better strategy.
Yes, I think that's the point, really, that it really just does come down pretty well every single time to the individual. And like you were saying, someone can swear blind this is what works for them because it is what works for them. But what is irritating is when someone tries to put that method that has worked perfectly for them in saying that it's going to work perfectly for you too, when it might not.
Mm-hmm. And
people can be completely opposed to what works for them individually, and if they switched, they'd gain weight maybe,
right?
Or maybe it would work just as well with a different method. But it really does come down to trial and error with the individual, doesn't it?
There are other factors that not every model of obesity is going to take into account perfectly.
Exactly. We've got so many questions that we're going to have to run into a double show for this.
Fantastic.
So we're... I know. I knew it was going to be popular when I put the question out there. So we're going to wrap up now and come back for part 2 next week. So thank you very much, Amber.
Thank you so much.
To get the resources and links from the show, please go to ketowomanpodcast.com. Are you my next extraordinary woman? Maybe you've got an idea for a show, a topic you want to hear about. Let me know how I can tickle your earbuds by dropping me a line at daisy@ketowomanpodcast.com. If you fancy joining me on this exciting adventure and want to help me create new episodes, please go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/ketowoman. Or simply hit the support button on the Keto Woman podcast website. It's thanks to the 2 Keto Dudes that I'm hosting this podcast, so please consider heading to their Patreon page at patreon.2keto.com and help them bring you more podcasts like this one. Please help other people hear about and find this podcast by reviewing the show on iTunes and Facebook. Every star and review really does help. It doesn't go unnoticed by me, the people who regularly like, share and comment on my posts. Your support means the world to me. Thank you. This week's quote is from Robert Broil. For the most part, we carnivores do not eat other carnivores. We prefer to eat our vegetarian friends. Bye-bye, Keto Lovelies.